If you're wondering whether or not you should settle your case or go to court, this is the podcast you want to listen to because I'm going to give you all the tips and tricks that you need to know as to whether or not you should settle or whether or not you should file a lawsuit. My name is Michael Coker. I'm a personal injury lawyer in Lawrenceville, and I've been practicing personal injury law for over 15 years. And the reality is that this is one of the hardest decisions that you need to make in your case, is whether or not you should settle or whether or not you should proceed with filing a lawsuit. Now, every case is different, and so only an experienced attorney who understands the specific facts of your case is going to be able to give you the advice that you need to determine whether or not you should go to court or whether or not you should take a settlement. But I'm going to provide you with some general advice and some general rules that you might want to consider that will help you make that decision. First, in most cases, it's generally a good idea to try and do a settlement prior to filing a lawsuit. There are certain circumstances that you might be, surprised to find out that there are certain cases that insurance companies just don't want to get out and don't want to go to court, particularly ones that have some sort of corporation involved that might involve the media, or it might be a bad look for that particular company. They might actually offer you a better settlement to not have the facts of your case be put into the public. And so you might actually be hurting the value of your case in those specific cases by filing a lawsuit. When the company now has all the facts come to light, they're all in public, they don't have that incentive to then try to settle it before those facts become public. So that's just one example of why you might want to settle your case before a lawsuit is filed. But let's talk about some of the others. First off, if your case is settled without a lawsuit, it generally goes a lot faster. I usually tell my clients that most cases can be settled, or at least we can get the insurance company to their top offer within a couple months after you finish your medical treatment. And so you're going to have a decision to make, and you're going to have a number that's on the table really a couple months into you finishing your medical care. And so that's going to be a much faster and more efficient way to get everything resolved. And so if you settle pre-suit, you don't have to wait as long. You also don't have to go through the complex and difficult parts of discovery or the lawsuit. You don't have to put your life on trial. And so when you file a lawsuit, there's a thing called a discovery period. And a discovery period is where both parties exchange all the information that they have about your particular case. Now, for you, that might mean that you have to disclose some personal things like your medical history, other car accidents you've been involved in, criminal histories, those kind of items. And so if that's a concern for you, if you really don't want your life to be put under a microscope and for you to have your entire life put on display, I would generally recommend that you consider discussing with your attorney settling before filing a lawsuit. Because going through the litigation process is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it is a difficult and tedious process. I tell my clients in Georgia that they can expect to be in that process for a minimum of 2 years. And it's a constant phone calls, constant emails from the attorney staff. It's a lot of depositions. So it's you coming and giving your statement about what happened in the accident or what happened in the incident, but also giving statements about your medical history and different conditions you face, different car accidents, other car accidents you might have been in. And for some of my clients, going through that experience is just too stressful. And so there's a value that they place on not having to be paraded out and put their life on display in litigation. And so that's one of the major considerations that you need to think about is this something that I feel comfortable giving deposition statements, having an insurance company comb through my medical records and my medical history, or is it better for me just to get the case resolved? And so that might be another reason for you to consider settling your case. People always ask, well, am I going to get the full value of my settlement if I settle before the lawsuit's filed? And the answer is, in most cases, the reality is you're not. You generally are not going to get the full value of your case unless a lawsuit's filed. But again, you have to factor in all those other factors, all those other items that you might not be thinking about, like the time it takes to get to court, the stress and anxiety of going through a deposition. Those are all cost. And so there's a value to not having to deal with that. And so if you take all of these costs, all of these values, and add that to the amount of the settlement that you're getting pre-suit, it might be worth it for you to settle without filing a lawsuit. Also, lawsuits are extremely expensive. And generally, in most cases, the expenses come out of your bottom line at the end of the case. And so that's another conversation to have with your lawyer is the amount of the expenses that it's going to take to get this case to a trial worth it for me to continue? Now, there's usually two factors that you need to consider. The first is, for most personal injury lawyers, the contingency fee rate goes up. Ours does. It goes from 33% if the case is settled before a lawsuit to 40% after we file a lawsuit. And so when you consider that those costs are going up, that you're going to be paying the attorney more, number one, that's something that you need to consider before filing suit. And you need to sit down and say, okay, if I'm paying this attorney an extra six and a little bit more percent, is it still worth it? Is the amount I'm going to get at trial substantially worth more to cover that additional cost? The other consideration are court costs and expenses. And it is not uncommon for me to spend $10,000, even up to $50,000 on certain cases as far as case expenses. And those expenses come out of your bottom line at the end of the case. And so a great lawyer will sit down with you before you file the lawsuit and will say, okay, these are my projected costs. This is the additional cost you're going to pay me for that additional percentage for filing the lawsuit. These are those expected costs. This is what I expect we could get at trial, the range. And so you're going to walk away with this amount. And if that amount is the same or less than what you would get right now for settling, I usually recommend at that point you seriously consider taking the settlement. Because why would you go through 2 years? Why would you go through the hassle of a litigation just to come out with less money than you would have had if you just took the money right now? And so again, this is another thing that a great lawyer will sit down and do. We'll sit down and do the math with you and say, hey, I think if we go to court, if we go to trial, then our best day in court is this and our worst day is this. And after expenses, after that increased fee, this is what you're going to net. This is what's going to be in your pocket. And if you don't have that number, if your lawyer's not providing you those net numbers of what you think you're going to get in your pocket, then I would greatly recommend you speak to a different attorney. One of the most frustrating things that I see, unfortunately, in my practice is that there are attorneys out there that will just call the client and say, hey, we're going to settle your case for $100,000. Well, $100,000 might be a great settlement for you if you have $2,000 worth of unpaid medical bills. But if you end up having substantially more, like let's say you had $80,000 in medical bills, then $100,000 is not going to be a great settlement because the amount you're going to net is going to be close to zero. And that's not fair to you as the client. And so these are all items, these are all things that you need to consider when you're having that math analysis in the process. And so I would say if you would like to talk to a different attorney, if you want a second opinion, don't hesitate to call a different attorney if you are not getting that bottom line number of what you're going to get in your pocket. And so all these factors, all these considerations are things you need to think about when you're deciding whether or not to settle your case before the lawsuit's filed or proceed to trial. We've talked a little bit about the considerations for settlement before a lawsuit's filed, but let's talk a little bit about what comes after a lawsuit's filed. So we talked a little bit about the discovery process. So you can expect that you are going to basically have to wait for what is a minimum 6-month discovery process in most cases. And so during this process, you'll continue to share documents, you'll continue to give depositions, and there's not going to be very many updates. Sometimes I think clients in litigation are frustrated at how slowly the court process moves. So your attorney might get a court notice for a hearing that might be set 60, 45 days in the future. And so a lot of times the case can't progress until they get direction from the judge. And so that case is going to stall for those 45 or 60 days. Now, at my law firm, we make it a habit to call and talk to every single client at least once a month to give you an update. But the reality is for cases in litigation, cases that are in a lawsuit, sometimes there's not an update to give. Sometimes it's, hey, we're still waiting on the court, or hey, we're still waiting on our court date. These are all things, all considerations that you need to think about. And so if you're someone that wants constant updates and for things to always be moving, litigation might not be for you because it is such a slow and tedious process. And so whether or not you decide to take your case all the way to court is something that you need to consider and you need to talk to an experienced attorney about. For example, when you go to your attorney's office, one of the first things that I would ask if I were you as the client is this case worth filing? Because if the case is not worth filing, if it's not worth going to court, I generally recommend that you consider taking the settlement. Because the reality is not all cases are destined for court and not all cases are great court cases. Take, for example, a case that's extremely high risk. Let's say there's a case where, the liability is questionable. Maybe we don't really know if you caused the incident or someone else, or if the company that you're alleging is at fault. These are all factors that you need to consider because no two cases are created equally. So if you have a case, for example, where it's questionable liability that you might walk out with zero at the trial, again, you might want to consider this might not be a case that I want to take all the way to court and have a jury decide, because that's an extremely high-risk case, right? You might come out with nothing after 2 years of time, all this work, and then the emotional stress of basically realizing that you didn't receive what you were entitled to. But let's say it's a clear liability case. Let's say the defendant's admitted fault. You're just fighting over how much money to award. There's always risk involved in cases, but there's always something that I would consider as something you need to make sure that you continue doing and that you make sure that you understand that this is a case that I understand the risk, that I know what's happening, and that I understand what is moving forward. And so these are all items that I would definitely recommend that you consider and speak with an attorney about. So that's just a little bit of an understanding for you to kind of get an idea of what the difference is between settling your case pre-suit and taking your case to court. There's a lot of factors, there's a lot of items that are involved and really require a deep dive into your specific case. You don't have to call me. But if you want to call me, I'd be more than happy to take a look at your personal injury case and give you advice on what you should consider with the risk associated with the specific facts of your case, dealing with things like how risky is the case that you're going to walk away with nothing? Or, how busy is your life? Are you going to be able to attend court hearings and depositions? And how likely are we to prove that your injuries or your surgery or whatever it may be is actually related or caused by this particular incident? These are all factors that only an experienced lawyer can evaluate and can best advise you as to whether or not you should file a lawsuit or just go ahead and consider a settlement pre-suit. And so I appreciate you listening to this podcast. Hopefully you got some information about the importance of understanding the differences in your specific case and how it matters whether you should settle or file a lawsuit. If I can help you in any other way, or if you like getting these updates, obviously like and subscribe to this podcast. We're going to keep putting these out to the public as kind of a public service to say thank you for trusting us with cases in the past, but more importantly, just to provide important information for people who've maybe never been in this situation before. And so again, my name is Michael Coker. This has been the Georgia Legal Talks podcast. Thanks for listening.